Hello, this is Darren Ekstrom, and this is my day 3 lecture for my lesson plans, unit plan in multimedia and education. And today is the 13th of March, 2013. Alright, I made a slideshow PowerPoint to go along with my teacher talk. And I have an opener with a question that says, who was Herbert Hoover and what did he try to do for the United States? And how do you believe he was viewed by the American people at the onset of the Great Depression? So I'll be expecting answers about Herbert Hoover, about like the Hoover Dam and the hurry up and wait mentality that he put out there to wait and see, let the economy sort itself out, and also his economic programs like dams and anything else you think of. And then the title page is on the next one, and then moving on to the teacher talk. It says the Roaring Twenties is a way that some refer to the 1920s. There was lots of post-World War I enthusiasm and patriotism. World War I is also called the Great War by people. It's kind of a different way to say it. And that's what people thought was the war to end all wars. And there was sustained economic prosperity after World War I for the 1920s. And there were cultural aspects concentrated in large urban areas like New York City, Paris, Berlin, and London. There was a focus turning towards celebrities, which is a common thing today. You see people often obsessing about celebrities almost, it seems like. And some of that came out of the Roaring Twenties and the Great Depression, and the movies that came out of that, the music, the radio, all sorts of different things that kind of came out of that. And we have a kind of a change in gender roles a little bit. The female flappers is what they're called, and jazz music was becoming popular. Jazz music was kind of originated with African American history, and people starting to adopt that more with the white colored skinned people, the lighter colored, I mean. And the flappers, the females, they kind of redefined questioning acceptable behavior, and they redefined gender roles by doing that. And there was also a shift after the Civil War and after World War I about women taking men's jobs, and women become jobs that were predominantly men's in the past, the men's jobs, and they were starting to work on this power struggle that would lead to the civil rights movement in the 1960s later on. And so they kind of started to realize a little more what it meant to have a job in the United States, and how that could be a spot of inequality. And they'd recognized that before, but it's becoming more prominent. In the late 1920s, with President Herbert Hoover assessing American prosperity, says Hoover attributing prosperity to self-government through local agency, individual freedom to encourage freedom, and equality of opportunity. So we see that equality of opportunity coming out in one of the reasons for prosperity for Herbert Hoover. Moving on to slide 4, the Dust Bowl. The Dust Bowl further encouraged the Great Depression with less crop production, poor living conditions, hunger, forcing many to migrate away. Primarily impacted the southern plains, the Great Plains, and people would migrate out of there because of that situation. There'd be sustained drought and poor agriculture practices that helped cause the Dust Bowl. And that, again, that's above Texas and kind of southeast Colorado. There was this act called the Emergency Farm Act that allotted $200 million to help farmers facing foreclosure in 1933 with refinancing mortgages. And also later in the New Deal, there was the AAA, the Agricultural Act, that actually paid farmers to not work so that the price of crops would go up, help the economy. The Grapes of Wrath book was written in 1939. It's kind of a popular book, often read in schools and different places, written by John Steinbeck. Here's a quote from that book. It says, "They streamed over the mountains, hungry and restless as ants, scurrying to find work to do, to lift, to push, to pull, to pick, to cut, anything, any burden to bear, for food. The kids are hungry. We got no place to live, like ants scurrying for work, for food, and most of all for land." So people were pushing to survive, pushing to get food. That's one of the necessities of life, and it just was difficult to get when the crops weren't coming up, and you could import food and cattle, but it's hard to get food to sell to make money and do that through the system, the social capitalist system. All right, the story Grapes of Wrath. It's about a family driven away from Oklahoma in the Great Depression due to drought and hardship. And here's another quote about the Dust Bowl from an unknown source. It was on the website listed below there, but it had a source link and it didn't take for some reason. But this is what it said. I thought it was interesting. It said, "The simplest acts of life, breathing, eating a meal, taking a walk, were no longer simple. Children wore dust masks to and from school. Women hung wet sheets over windows in a futile attempt to stop the dirt. Farmers watched helplessly as their crops blew away." So yeah, that sounds pretty rough. Just dirt surrounding you quite a bit. And I read about something or I saw a video that I'm going to give students a link to later in this class. It's about the Dust Bowl and how people would start to develop some kind of disease because of inhaling dust or something. Just something with the adverse conditions, at least. I know. Moving on to slide 5. The stock market. Stock market crash was in October 1929 and is marking point for the Great Depression for many people. There was actually kind of a depression starting 6 months prior, in October of 29, but the stock market crash kind of put the hammer in the nail, kind of made it official for many people, at least. Stock value dropping gradually over the next 3 years. So it got down to about 20% of what they were worth. So you can imagine if you buy something at the store like a HD TV and you want to sell it, resell it shortly after, but the price goes down to 20% of what it's worth, that'll make you kind of depressed a little bit because you don't get the worth that you paid for it. You feel kind of robbed, probably. There's a decline in the value of assets too, like the HD TV thing. Banks were failing. 11,000 of the 25,000 banks failed by 1933. So people were taking money out of the banks and banks could no longer do business. So that all went downhill. There was this thing called speculation in the stock market that premeditated the crash. It encouraged it. It's kind of a risky financial investment, but it's not always a negative aspect. It sort of was during this time because people were making risky stock market investments with deficit money they didn't have really, and that it all kind of fell down because of that. So a positive one that I read about was this guy named Victor Niederhofer. He described that speculation isn't always a bad thing because, say you have a small crop yield and investors start investing and boosting the price and encouraging others to produce because the price of that crop goes up. And if it's a rare crop, usually the price goes up. But so today that would be something that doesn't have to be as negative as it was back then when the prices were dropping. All right, going on to slide 6, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, president from 1933 to 1945. He was one of the only few presidents reelected for a third term, which is sort of against the U.S. Constitution. They call for only 2 terms. Abraham Lincoln was also reelected for a third term. He died shortly after that from assassination. And actually, Franklin Roosevelt was elected for a 4th term, which he died shortly after with a stroke. He had a rare disease called polio. He was in a wheelchair most of his presidency. That would be weird if it was his pregnancy. Probably not that. But they took pictures of him and things that made him look like he wasn't in a wheelchair. They used kind of camera tricks and angle tricks to just make him look like he wasn't in that kind of position that could be perceived as weakness by some. He spoke to Americans in more informal, casual ways. He'd sit next to a fireplace for a discussion known as fireside chats, and he would just be more informal than American people were used to. What was interesting he was interested in saving capitalism after the strong economic depression. He kind of took on an experimental, let's try this attitude. And this idea of saving capitalism, it kind of later influenced aspects after World War II, 1939 to 1945, in the Cold War with Russia and the social system battle between communism and capitalism. So that was influential towards the future, which, many things are. Initiated the New Deal with FDR. He had several factors aimed in that New Deal at specifically trying to help the economic recovery and not having this more relaxed aspect, this more relaxed attitude to let the economy correct itself. He wanted to be proactive and experiment with different initiatives like the Tennessee Valley Authority, or the TVA for short, where they made dams to control flooding and make electricity, generate electricity in a way that was beneficial. It didn't take a lot to create that energy, just water naturally flowing. And it also created other electrical technologies and inspired agriculture, I believe, also. Alright, the New Deal, moving on to slide 7, aims for relief, recovery, and reform in the New Deal. So he wanted to relieve, reform. Like I said, he developed a let's try this attitude toward the New Deal and enacting new legislation, organization type of things, and was really more open-ended type of experimental instead of really being strict about his ideas. He was a little bit in this thing called court packing. He tried to get many Supreme Courts added to the regular amount of Supreme Courts so he could get some of his initiatives passed, but they called him out on that and said that's kind of not constitutional, so I believe he backed off. He was really helpful in the banking crisis. He stopped the banks, closed the banks, and created this bank holiday, is what he called it. And as people were taking money out and the banks would close, he closed the banks, and then kind of got on the loudspeaker and said that it was okay for people to leave money in the banks. It was going to be safe. And that in itself kind of helped people trust the banks a little better. The alphabet soup programs of the New Deal legislation, like the WPA, NRA, FHA, TVA, IRA, and AAA. A lot of triple letter programs and legislation got pushed out. The WPA is stands for Workers' Progress Association. They built things like railroads, lighthouses. I think in Minotaur over in Nebraska, I heard they built the Minotaur Lake and the lighthouse out there, and different working construction initiatives like that. The NRA, National Recovery Administration, involved in recovery initiatives there. The Federal Housing Authority, obviously working with housing, building houses, and pricing of houses, I'm sure. Industrial Recovery Act, industry, factories and plants, and trying to keep those all going and on track. And the Agricultural Adjustments Act, that's the AAA that I was trying to think of earlier. That's where they would pay farmers to stop working sometimes so that crops could be worth more, and then ideally people would want to work at crops more because they would be able to make more money doing that. and for other reasons. If you were to help reform the United States, what might you focus on and why? What would you try to change or add to the U.S. programs or policy? So that is a question I would ask the students to answer. And then following that, I have a video set up about the Great Depression, which is about 15 minutes long, with 10 minutes on one and then half of the next section. It's a full program. It's about, I think, probably an hour long program, but just watch a little bit about it here, about the beginnings in the stock market. And then on to slide 9, I looked up this book by Powell. He's kind of got an interesting title describing why the New Deal actually extended the Great Depression. So I was interested in that. And so he argues that the New Deal was not a very effective recovery setup, obviously. He thinks it actually added to it. Here's a quote from the book. It says, "Whatever it was not a recovery program, or at any rate an effective one." And that was actually from a man named Kennedy's book called Freedom of Fear from 1999. I believe he was from Stanford. And Powell, he describes in the book in 2002, when he wrote it, how employment rates did not get below 14% during the 1930s. And that he describes that as an indicator that the New Deal was not really doing what it was supposed to be doing through Congress and mostly Franklin Roosevelt's experimenting. He argues that it wasn't helping. It was actually possibly doing some worse things that could have been prevented. I'm a little skeptical of that, but it's an interesting idea. He argues that the New Deal actually prolonged the Great Depression, like I said. And he also says something interesting about Germany. He said the Great Depression influenced European countries like Germany, which we'll get to in a second. But Germany, I believe, got down to 25% of the workforce was out of a job, and that influenced them to look towards more extreme leaders like the mostly lunatic, mostly crazy Adolf Hitler, who had some interesting ideas, for leading a country, kind of some, you'd call him a despot or a tyrant. He was a leader, an absolute leader, and people kind of got behind him, wouldn't question him. And in World War II, you probably know, he did some not so good things with the Jews, anti-Jewish sentiments, and was the primary reason for the killing of several Jews, many Jews, Jewish believers. So what is your current impression about the New Deal? What implications do you believe it had toward economic recovery? So I know we just read about someone that's kind of more critical about the New Deal, but we also read about some things that the New Deal did sort of well, and including the agriculture, the banking. I'm not sure if the agriculture did extremely well, but it did something to spur on crops and production, I believe. So I'd ask students that. Moving on to slide 10. It says the depression spread internationally quickly, partly due to diplomatic response of raising tariffs. Now a tariff, as is in our vocabulary list, is defined as taxes, duties, or customs on exports and imports by a government. So this really put a limit on the trade that was happening. The trade was becoming less and less, and some countries kind of rely on trade sometimes with other countries, with oil more recently, and other things, food sometimes. Overseas countries like Germany, Britain suffer actually more than the United States, is what this website says below. And you don't often hear that Europe might have suffered a little more than America, because we often focus on the effects on Americans and some other aspects. Here's a quote from that same website. It says, restating what I said earlier, it says, in Germany, unemployment rose sharply beginning in late 1929, and by early 1932 it had reached 6 million workers, or 25% of the workforce. Britain was less severely affected by its industrial and export sectors. But its industrial and export sectors remained seriously depressed until World War II. So Britain, not as bad as Germany, but still pretty bad. And 6 million workers, that's pretty amazing to think about. 6 million people out of work, looking for food, looking for government help or whatever they can to try to get things going. That it seems accurate that they would be turning to things like extremist leaders. The next map on slide 11, it kind of shows a map of the Depression and where areas declined. You don't see, the only place that you see economic revival is southern Texas for some reason. Not sure why. That could be something looked into. Also a little in California, it looks like, in Washington. Washington, kind of the central place there for government. Anyways, so where I would ask students, where are the areas hit with the most economic decline according to this map, and where are the areas of the most relief and recovery spending? So you see those relief and recovery spending are kind of stark, kind of a lot of spending for recovery in Wyoming, Idaho, Nevada, Arizona. Surprisingly not in the Dust Bowl area, but just right around it. So just some interesting, just to get a feel of the overall look on that map. Then I'd move the class into talking about the extra credit assignment I have there, and whatever else might be going on with the students. And thanks for listening. Have a good day.